You already know what you should be doing right now? That's the thing about procrastination that nobody talks about honestly. It's not a knowledge problem. You know the task. You know it matters. You know that starting would make you feel better than not starting. You know that future you is going to be frustrated with present you, because future you always is. You have all of that information fully available right now, and you're still not doing it. That gap between knowing and doing, between intending and starting, is the one that has probably followed you across jobs, across projects, across years of your life. And if you've ever tried to close it by getting more organized, making better to-do lists, finding the right productivity system, or simply deciding to be the kind of person who just gets things done, you already know how that went, because the system works for a week, maybe two. And then something happens. The resistance comes back. The task sits there, and you're back to doing everything except the thing. Most content about procrastination treats it as a discipline problem, a motivation problem, a time management problem. It is none of those things. And the moment you understand what it actually is, the real mechanism running underneath every loop of avoidance, something shifts, not magically, but permanently. Because you stop fighting the wrong thing. Here's the real reason you keep procrastinating and can't stop. The story everyone believes, and why it's wrong. The conventional narrative about procrastination is remarkably consistent and remarkably unhelpful. It goes like this. Procrastinators lack self-discipline. They prioritize short-term comfort over long-term reward. They are, at some fundamental level, choosing pleasure over responsibility, and the solution is to want the outcome badly enough to override that preference. Work harder. Care more. Build better habits. Be the person who does the hard thing. That story feels true from the inside because the behavior it describes is real. You are choosing something else over the task. The task isn't getting done, so discipline must be the missing variable. But here's what that story completely misses. People with procrastination tendencies don't avoid hard things. They often work extremely hard at the wrong things at the last minute, always under conditions of maximum stress, on tasks adjacent to the one they were supposed to be doing. The avoidance is not global. It is highly specific. It attaches to particular kinds of tasks in particular kinds of conditions. And that specificity is the first major clue that what's happening has nothing to do with laziness or self-discipline. Research in psychology has been building toward a different conclusion for decades, and it's now fairly settled. Chronic procrastination is not a time management problem. It is an emotion regulation problem. Specifically, it is a strategy, automatic, unconscious, and remarkably consistent, for avoiding the negative emotional states that a particular task triggers. Not the task itself, the feelings the task produces. If this is landing differently than what you've heard about procrastination before, I'll hit the like button. Because getting this mechanism right changes everything about what you do next. What the task is actually triggering. Here's where it gets specific. And specific is what matters, because procrastination is not one thing. It wears different faces depending on the person and the task, but the emotional drivers underneath it tend to fall into a small number of recognizable patterns. The most common is fear of failure, but not in the obvious way. It's not usually a conscious thought that says, "I'm afraid to fail at this." It's more subtle and more pervasive than that. It's a background sense that the completed version of the task will reveal something unflattering about your abilities, your intelligence, or your worth. That once it's done and visible, it can be evaluated. And evaluation means the possibility of the verdict coming back wrong. The procrastination protects against that verdict. As long as the task isn't done, it can't be judged. As long as you haven't really tried, the failure isn't really yours. It belongs to the circumstances, the timeline, the interruptions. Starting in earnest means putting something real at stake. And the unconscious mind, which has been managing your threat responses since long before you had the vocabulary to describe them, treats that stake as a risk worth avoiding. The second pattern is fear of success, which sounds counterintuitive until it doesn't. For some people, completing a task successfully raises the bar. It establishes a new standard they'll then be expected to maintain. It changes what's expected of them in ways that feel exposing or overwhelming. And so the avoidance is not of failure, but of the consequences of doing well. The visibility, the responsibility, the new version of themselves that success would seem to require. The third pattern, and this is the one most people don't expect, is perfectionism. Not the kind that produces high standards and meticulous work. The kind that makes starting feel impossible, because anything less than an ideal outcome feels intolerable before it's even begun. The task sits there, enormous and unstarted, because the gap between the imagined perfect version and whatever would actually get produced feels too large to cross, so it doesn't get started at all, which feels perversely safer than starting and falling short. The nervous system underneath it all, ascertain what all three of these patterns have in common. And this is the mechanism that most content on procrastination never reaches, is that they are driven by threat activation in the nervous system, not by rational calculation in the conscious mind. When you sit down to begin a task that carries any of these emotional weights, something happens in the body before a single conscious thought occurs. A subtle but real activation. A low-level signal that says, this is dangerous territory. Not dangerous in the physical sense, but dangerous in the sense that matters most to the social, evaluative, identity-conscious brain. The kind of dangerous that means you could be seen and found wanting. And the brain's response to that signal is the same response it has to any threat. Avoidance or escape. Not because you're weak, because that's what threat detection systems do. They move you away from the source of the threat, and the task in that moment is the source. This is why willpower fails as a solution. Willpower is a prefrontal cortex function, a deliberate, conscious override of an impulse. But when the threat system is activated, prefrontal capacity is suppressed. You are trying to use rational determination to overcome a process that is running at a neurological level below the reach of rational determination. It works occasionally, under low threat conditions. It fails reliably under high ones. And then you blame your own discipline for a failure that was actually structural. Save this video, because what comes next is the part that most people who procrastinate have been searching for. Not just the explanation, but the specific shift in approach that actually addresses the correct level of the problem. You'll want to come back to this. Why every system you've tried eventually failed. Think back through the strategies you've used. Time blocking, the 2-minute rule. Accountability partners, habit trackers, body doubling, reward systems, deadlines you set for yourself that you then quietly moved. All of them probably worked, at least partially, at least for a while, and then they stopped working. And you concluded either that the system was flawed or that you were. Neither conclusion was correct. The systems failed because they were all operating on the surface layer, the behavioral layer, without addressing the emotional layer underneath. They were attempting to change what you do without changing what the task means to your nervous system. And the nervous system, running its threat avoidance programming automatically and continuously, simply roots around the behavioral intervention. It finds a new form of avoidance, a different distraction, a more sophisticated rationalization for why today isn't the right day to start. The intervention that actually works, that research in emotion regulation and behavioral psychology consistently supports, is not a productivity system. It is a change in the emotional relationship between you and the task, specifically, identifying the precise emotional threat the task carries, naming it explicitly, and reducing the nervous system's classification of the task from threat to tolerable discomfort. That last distinction matters enormously. The goal is not to make the task feel good. It is to make it feel survivable. Because tolerable discomfort is something the prefrontal cortex can work with. Active threat is something it gets shut out of. Here is what that looks like in practice. Before the task, instead of trying to motivate yourself toward the outcome, you ask a different question. What specifically am I afraid will happen if I do this? Not vaguely, specifically. Is it that the result will be judged and found inadequate? That finishing this will raise expectations I'm not sure I can meet? That starting in earnest means I can no longer protect myself with the excuse that I haven't really tried yet. Name it. Out loud if possible. In writing, if that's easier. The act of naming the specific emotional threat does something measurable at the neurological level. The same affect labeling mechanism that works in overthinking spirals works here too. It reduces amygdala activation. It creates just enough distance between the threat signal and your response to it that the prefrontal cortex can partially re-engage. And from that partial re-engagement, starting becomes possible. Not easy, but possible. The people who share this tend to share it with someone specific. Someone they've watched struggle with this for years, who has the ability, who has the intentions, who keeps not starting, and who has probably concluded by now that the problem is something unfixable about who they are. If that person came to mind, this is worth sending. Because the reframe this video offers is not a small one for the people who need it. What the research actually points toward. Here's the insight that tends to land the hardest, and the one most worth sitting with after this video ends. The tasks you procrastinate on most are almost never the tasks you care about least. They're the tasks you care about most. The ones where the outcome is most connected to your sense of who you are and what you're capable of. The creative project, the career move, the thing that would actually change something significant. Those are the ones that sit longest. Not because they matter least, because they matter most, and mattering most means the emotional stakes attached to them are highest. Your procrastination is not evidence of indifference. It is, in a deeply uncomfortable and completely backwards way, evidence of how much you care. The avoidance is proportional to the investment, and understanding that, really sitting with it, changes the story you tell yourself about what the pattern means. There is a video on this channel that goes directly into the specific emotion regulation techniques that research supports for breaking the procrastination cycle at the level that actually sticks, not the behavioral surface, but the nervous system pattern underneath it. That is the next logical step from what we covered today. And if today reframed something you've been trying to solve for years by working on the wrong layer, following that thread is where the real change lives. If the procrastination has reached a point where it's significantly affecting your work, your relationships, or your sense of yourself, please don't hesitate to speak to a mental health professional. What we've described today is real, well-researched, and responds to the right kind of support more quickly than most people expect. Would drop a comment with the specific task you've been avoiding the longest. Not because naming it publicly is going to fix it, but because seeing how many other people are carrying the same specific kind of avoidance changes something about how alone the pattern feels. Those responses matter to everyone watching who has been concluding that this is a personal failing rather than a human one. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.